Welcome, everyone, to Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We're your hosts and co-founders of FantasyForesight.com, coming to you from the Rambo Fixture Company studios. I'm Ben.
And I'm Jay.
You ready to get rolling, Jay?
You know it. Let's do this.
All right, let's go. Welcome in, everyone. It is Monday, July 8th. We've got the whole gang back together for you this week to discuss the wide receivers and tight ends of the NFC East. How you doing tonight, Jay?
Ben, you know I'm doing great. The NFC East is near and dear to my heart, and I cannot wait to dive in to this wide receiver and tight end core from this division. It's going to be outstanding and interesting. Steve, the Encyclopedia, how are you doing tonight, my friend?
I'm doing great, guys. I'm happy to be back, spending time with two of my Foresight family brothers, talking about the NFC East tonight, the wide receivers and tight ends. Can't wait to get into it, guys. Looking forward to it, and thanks for having me back.
Let's dive in.
Yeah, it's great to have you back, brother. It's great to have you back from vacation, Jay, and I'm ready to talk some fantasy football with you guys. Let's get it started. All right, this week we're going to flip it on its head a little bit and start off with the tight ends in the division and end up with the wide receivers in the off chance that we end up with another division full of dud tight ends. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Hope the listeners do too. But this week, we have an abundance of talent at the tight end position, starting off with Philadelphia Eagles tight end Zach Ertz. He is currently going at the 304 spot as tight end 2 overall, behind only Travis Kelce, in front of George Kittle and O.J. Howard. And this is according to fantasyfootballcalculator.com with 12-team PPR redraft settings. Everything we talk about is 12-team PPR redraft. Everything we talk about in ADP is fantasyfootballcalculator.com. All right. So both the Foresight projection, which is the aggregate projection of all of the big guys out there, the 2019 Foresight projection for Zach Ertz is tight end 2. We call that the consensus. Total Foresight has him ranked also as tight end 2 this year. So we love seeing that agreement, that correlation between the two of them. Fantasy Pro Strength, the schedule ranks him as 8th out of 32. Savage, considering the quality and quantity of the fantasy points allowed, gives it a 19th out of 32 rating, so a little bit tougher than what the masses think. And when you take a look at Zach Ertz's 2018 statistics, the man was insane. He played all 16 games. He was tight end 2 overall, tight end 2 in fantasy points per game, tight end 1 in targets, tight end 1 in receptions, tight end 3 in receiving yards, and tight end 10 in yards per reception. And then he added 8 touchdowns, which was good for tight end 3. When you look at his career, he gets better every single year. Started as tight end 23, next year, tight end 13, next year, tight end 9, next year, tight end 6, next year, tight end 3, and last year, tight end 2. I think tight end 1 is in his crosshairs this year, and you got a little bit more support to that argument when you take a look at next-gen stats.
Yes, take a look at his next-gen stats. His average separation, and we are grouping together all wide receivers, all running backs, and all tight ends. Zach Ertz is WRT 34 overall in average separation for a tight end. I mean, that's ridiculous. You think about how many receivers are out there, and he's getting more separation than all those beasts, and running backs out of the backfield.
You're right. And real quick, normally in 12-team leagues, you think of the top 12 as like a quarterback 1 or running back 1 or wide receiver 1. So when you're grouping 3 positions together, that same criteria applies to 36 theoretically. So when he's WRT 34, that means Zach Ertz is getting average separation that is on an elite level with running backs and wide receivers everywhere across the NFL.
Okay, and if you like that, you're really going to like this. As a player who has the highest percentage of his team's total air yards, Zach Ertz is wide receiver, running back, and tight end 29 overall. Think about that for a second. Think about that.
Well, you know what? When you look at Zach Ertz from a consistency standpoint, right in line with everything you already said, Benny, dude was a beast. 60% of the time, he was in the top 6 at the position last season, behind only Travis Kelce. And then when you look at how often he was a tight end 1 last season 80% of the time, which is just insane when you think about it. And he actually tied with Travis Kelce for that metric. And then when you look at his overall average weekly ranking, he bested all of the tight ends last season. Tight end 1, which is incredible. So when you look at it from a consistency standpoint, you could make the argument you could do as well with Travis Kelce, if not a little better, but then there's nobody else when it came to consistency outside of Ertz. Guys, as you recall, I'm the person who took Zach Ertz a little early in our mock draft episode. So with that being said, I do have to come clean a little bit here and say I have tempered my expectations for Ertz a little bit, and it's nothing to do with the narrative of Dallas Goedert eating into his production or the addition of JJ Arcega-Whiteside or them bringing back Djax. It's more for me the additions of Miles Sanders, who they invested a second-round pick in, and then bringing in Jordan Howard. Because, Jay, your Super Bowl championship Eagles in 2017, when I went back and took a look at that year, they were 6th in the NFL in rush attempts versus 20th last season, and 13th in pass attempts in 2017 versus 7th last season. And I think that they are going to want to scale back the passing volume and try to recapture that recipe for Super Bowl championship success, where we will see the volume drop a little bit. So I just think that whole recipe there is going to give us more of a 2017 Zach Ertz rather than a 2018. And there's nothing wrong with the 2017 version. That put him right up there in the top 2-3. So I'm not trying to say that at all. It's just like I said, I'm the dude who took him in the second round in the mock draft episode.
Well, Steve-O, you made my point for me. Even 2 years ago, he was tight end 3 overall. And we on this podcast heading into last season, Ben and I had a healthy debate over should we expect regression from Zach Ertz with the receivers that they had on the team, with the drafting of Dallas Goedert, and all of the other variables that went into it, and natural just regression of not being able to consistently maintain a top-end performance in the fantasy world. And what did he do? He went out and did it again. So here's how I feel about Zach Ertz now. He's very similar in my eyes to Larry Fitzgerald, a player who you're continually waiting to drop off, and it just never happens. So as far as I'm concerned, I am all in on Zach Ertz until I actually see his fantasy production drop off, because we have just gone through his stats. He is as consistent as they come. He is as productive as they come. And even if he has a little bit of regression in targets and receptions in the tight end position, he is still one of the top end and most elite in the game. So I feel fine drafting him and investing in him, whatever it is, wherever it is I take him in drafts.
I just have 3 quick things to say to that. Number one, as far as Larry Fitzgerald goes, this is only Ertz's 7th year. I mean, you can argue that the man's just now entering his prime, and he keeps getting better every single season. So we've got a long way to go before this man's fallen off the cliff, number one. Number two, time and time again, I have heard Zach Ertz described by his current and former teammates as the best wide receiver on that team. And that, number three, that is evidence when you look at 247sports.com. He had, quote, a record-setting 2018 season, setting the Philadelphia Eagles franchise record for catches in a season and the NFL record for catches by a tight end in a season. So that just lends to the narrative that Zach Ertz is the best wide receiver on that football team, and the next-gen stats back that up as well.
I couldn't agree more. And we talked about how Alshon has battled through injury, albeit very well, but he has still had nagging injuries. You have Deshaun Jackson, who we'll get to later, but he's a boom or bust kind of guy. And then you drafted a rookie, and I'm sorry, but rookies just don't have a propensity for stepping in and having an immediate impact at the NFL level. So I'm with you. Zach Ertz is the wide receiver to own in what can be a very prolific Philadelphia Eagles passing offense. Now, let's get on to a very interesting tight end, and that is one Evan Ingram of the New York Giants. Currently, he is being drafted in the 6th round at the 604 mark, tight end 6 overall, going right behind George Kittle, O.J. Howard, and in front of Eric Ebron and Jared Cook. His Foresight projection, his aggregate projection for this upcoming season, is tight end 4 overall. We have him ranked in our rankings at Total Foresight as tight end 6 overall. So coming off of his stellar rookie campaign where he put up tight end 5 overall numbers, he backed that up with a tight end 13 performance last year. Not terrible, still fine, but not a tight end 1 in the NFL. Now, if you look at his stats, he was tight end 7 in fantasy points per game. He did battle a little bit of injury last season for the first time. In receiving yards, he was tight end 12 with 577, a little bit of a dip for him. We talked all last season on this podcast about how he is volume dependent, and the volume wasn't there for him last season. But then you look at his yards per reception, and he ranked tight end 5 overall with a minimum of 45 receptions at 12.8 yards per reception. And I know the stats get even better when you look at his next-gen stats, Ben.
Yeah, we just talked about average separation with Zach Ertz amongst all wide receiver, running backs, and tight ends. He was 34 overall. All right. So where does Evan Ingram rank? Amongst all wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends, he is number 1 in the NFL, ladies and gentlemen. That is insane. I did not expect that number. I double and triple checked that number. And Evan Ingram is one of the most explosive pass catchers in the NFL. And then when you look at what he does once he gets the football, he is wide receiver, running back, tight end 2 overall with 6.1 yards after catch per reception. It's insane. And then when you take it one step further, per Pro Football Focus's Henry Buggy on July 2nd, quote, Evan Ingram posted the 5th best overall grade amongst tight ends with at least 25 targets in 2018. The biggest concern surrounding Big Blue's 6'3", 240-pound playmaker has been injuries. He's missed 6 games through his first 2 seasons and is currently dealing with a hamstring injury. But on the field, Ingram has shown nothing but improvement since entering the league, end quote. We do not like injuries on this podcast. We do not like hammies at this point in the season, but hammies can be healed with rest. Hammies can be taken care of by the time we get to training camp. So hopefully all is well. It will be one to monitor as long as there's no setbacks and limitations. I do happen to like his situation this year, but that hammy gives me a pause right now. And how did he look from a consistency perspective, Steve?
Well, considering he missed some games last season, he overall did fairly well. When you look at the times he finished in the top 6, he actually finished tied for tight end 9 in that metric. And when you look at him finishing as a tight end 1 on any given week throughout last season, he actually finished tied for tight end 7 at that metric. And when you look at him from an overall average weekly rank where games missed isn't going to hurt him, he finished at tight end 4 in that metric, which is, pretty impressive. Speaks to a lot of the things you guys just talked about when it comes to Evan Ingram. For me personally, the real only concern I have with him is, like with a lot of other people, health. And then also we've seen him support some really nice, fantasy stats when Eli Manning's leaned on him. And I just wonder how long Eli Manning will be the starting quarterback of the Giants and what that whole situation is going to look like for everybody wearing Big Blue if Daniel Jones takes the reins early in the season.
And you nailed it. That is exactly why Evan Ingram is so interesting heading into this season. Before I get into that, he did finish last season in the fantasy playoffs with a tight end 12, a tight end 1, and a tight end 4 performance in weeks 14 through 16. So you love seeing that in crunch time of the fantasy season. But getting back to 2019, you do have questionable quarterback play. That is a huge red flag. But then on the flip side, you do also have the loss of Odell Beckham, their major target monster on that offense, and we saw what this guy can be when they have limited weapons on offense. Now, yes, you still have Saquon Barkley, who is going to be a beast coming out of that backfield, and they have added some other pieces, but you would think that this is a season where Evan Ingram can take another step forward. Maybe not as high as his elite tight end 5 finish from his rookie season, but I think he can best what we saw out of him last season when he missed a few games, and you take a look at these metrics. Missed 5 games and still finished tight end 13.
That's a good point. And he was also the 4th most consistent tight end when he played while having Odell Beckham on the team, right, and also Saquon Barkley. Exactly. So essentially, you're trading the targets from Odell Beckham to Golden Tate, and everything else is staying the same. So if you just get the same level of production from Evan Ingram last year, if through 11 games, you get if he gets 5 more opportunities to at least match that overall production level, he's still going to be a top 6 tight end in the NFL.
And to further your point, we do not like injuries. We do not like risk when it comes to players on our fantasy team. But one reason why I like Evan Ingram, despite the injury issue, is he was there when it mattered for your fantasy team. He put up 3 straight tight end 1 weeks for you during the fantasy playoffs. And one of those was tight end 1 overall, and the other one was tight end 4 overall. So he's there when it matters, and that means a lot to me.
I mean, it's not like Zach Ertz had a bad playoff stretch, but which playoff stretch would you rather have out of your tight end over the last 3 weeks of the season? Tight end 14, tight end 24, tight end 1, or tight end 12, tight end 1, tight end 4.
Exactly.
I think we'd all go with the latter, and the latter is Evan Ingram. So you can't be beholden to just what last year was. Zach Ertz has been a playoff stud for many years out of his career. Steve makes a good point that they might be rushing the ball a little bit more this year. Jay makes a good point that even if his volume drops down, it's not going to matter. And then we all agree that as long as Evan Ingram can stay on the field, that he is going to be a tight end to make some noise out of this division as well. And then when you look at the next tight end in this division for the Washington Redskins, you've got Jordan Reed, who this conversation already has given me flashbacks to Devontae Parker, because for the first time in my fantasy life, I'm thinking that the price is right on this guy, because Jordan Reed is tight end 20 overall right now, going in the 14th round. And yet the aggregate projection out there at fantasyforesight.com illustrates that he's currently being viewed as tight end 7. Total Foresight, all things considered, likes him as tight end 9 this year compared to a price tag of tight end 20. And he actually did make it through 13 games last year, which is a lot for him. And I know he's an up and down guy, but he's the perfect guy that when he's healthy, you play him. And then when he's not, you don't worry about him. If you're in the past having to spend a 6th round draft pick on him, that is not at all worth it. In the 14th round, that's called a value.
It is. And no one's going to argue that when Jordan Reed is on the football field, he's a dynamic pass catcher and a dynamic player. That is absolutely true. The problem is he just can't stay on the field. You are paying a tight end 20 price, which is nothing. The end of a draft, he's essentially undrafted. But if you look at his career finishes, he's a career tight end 21, 3, 9, 36, 15. Is that a guy really that you're going to stash on your bench unless you're in an extremely deep league or playing best ball where you can spot duty?
If we look at points per game every single one of those seasons, those numbers are different. And in every one of those seasons, you're being asked to pay a price that's 2-3 times more than his price right now.
I can just never trust that he's going to get on the field for my fantasy team. Like, I don't want to hold a spot on my bench for a tight end.
You only would have had to worry about that 3 times last year.
Well,
for a 14th rounder, that is no problem at all.
Okay, but
you got to keep the price in perspective. We're not always talking about a 1st round pick here.
I get that, but he's a tight end 15. I mean, like, I'm not going to carry a backup tight end on my bench. I mean,
well, but what if you go 0 tight end and punt on the position altogether and you're just going to stream a guy?
Well, no, then I'll take Jordan Reed. Then I'll stream Jordan Reed.
Welcome to half of your audience.
Well, I know, but I'm not going to draft him and then stash him on my bench or rely on him on being one of my starting tight ends. I'm going to draft a guy who I can rely on, and when I need to, I'll stream Jordan Reed. It's not even
fair to call it a draft pick in the 14th round. Those are just like priority free agents.
We're arguing and we're agreeing that he's just a guy who you stream, and he's a great guy to stream, but he's not somebody who I'm going to hang on to long term on my fantasy team.
Do you ever hang on to any 14th round pick long term? No, that's my point. So what's your problem? It's a 14th round pick. Nobody's telling you to hang on to him.
I'm not drafting a tight end in the 14th round that I'm not going to hang on to for the whole
season. All right, guys, I jump in here as the tiebreaker real quick. So, or maybe not even a tiebreaker, but hey, to really quick touch on Jordan Reed's consistency last year. Well, we all know he's consistently missing games every season. That goes without say. But as far as his consistency goes, he was solid. He actually, even though he was on the field 13 games, like Ben mentioned, he wasn't as elite as we've seen him been when he has been on the field in the past. And I think some of that probably speaks to what his quarterback situation was and probably what we're going to see this year with the passing game in Washington. But overall, he did rank as the tight end 11 as far as his average weekly finish is concerned. So to Ben's point, if he's somebody that you can draft, say you are going 0 tight end, take him with your last pick. If he's healthy heading into the season, and you just say, hey, let it ride and just start him every week. And you eventually get to that point where he inevitably will go out with an injury. And then you just go, pick up the best thing that you can that's out there on the waiver wire.
And that doesn't mean that you don't drop him depending on what the injury is or how he's performing or what's available to you. Nobody's saying that you have to be married to your 14th round draft pick all season.
Listen, you're both dumb, all right? He's got a rookie quarterback. He's got terrible quarterback play. He's got arthritis all over his body from his 56 injuries. I didn't want to take it there with this guy, but now I'm going to because you're making me mad. Why wouldn't you take a chance on somebody with more upside than a tight end too?
Studs that are chilling in the 14th round that you're
round tight ends. That is actually good upside.
He's a tight end too. It's a low.
We are talking about the 14th round.
I know.
Thank you, Jordan Reed.
All right. Moving on to wide receivers. Let's take this over to hopefully a better conversation, even though I think that was probably entertaining for everybody. We're going to go to the Dallas Cowboys. The first wide receiver going off the board in the NFC East is Amari Cooper. Welcome back, Coop. How about that? Currently, Amari Cooper is being drafted in the 3rd round with a 304 selection as WR12 overall, going right behind Keenan Allen, T.Y. Hilton, and in front of A.J. Green and Stephon Diggs. Now, his aggregate projection on fantasyforesight.com is WR17. We have him in our total Foresight rankings as WR18. So right in line with that Foresight projection. We like seeing that. There's some consistency there. So far in his career, Amari Cooper has given us WR21, WR14, WR36, and WR19 finishes in Fantasyland. Kind of surprising. Okay, we all know he finished strong last season. How do his stats look? In 15 games played last year, he finished WR19 overall. He was WR22 in points per game, WR23 in targets with 107 targets, even with switching teams midway through the season. He was WR19 with 75 receptions. He was WR18 with over 1,000 yards last year, and WR17 in yards per reception, minimum 50 catches with a 13.4 yards per reception rate. Love seeing that. And then in receiving touchdowns, he was WR13 with 7 scores. You love seeing that too, Ben.
Yeah, and then the next gen stats, he didn't really pop that much, except
nobody cares what you have to say. Just move on.
Then when you look at the next gen stats, he was wide receiver, running back, tight end, 21 overall, and percentage of targeted air yards. And how crazy is that to think that is largely based off of 9 games with the Dallas Cowboys? It just gives you a sense of how involved he is going to be going forward in that offense. And then he was wide receiver, running back, tight end, 30 overall in yak per reception. He had a couple of big plays that might skew that a little bit, but you can't entirely discredit him for that either. And real quick, before we move on to the consistency studies, I just want to note that, as somebody who rostered Coop in 2018, I can personally speak to his up and downness even during his stint in Dallas. However, in 6 games in Oakland last season, he averaged 5 targets, 3.6 receptions, 46 yards, and only had 1 touchdown. In 9 games with Dallas, he averaged 8 targets. He averaged 5.89 receptions. He averaged 80 yards, and he had 6 touchdowns. So you can see that his volume and his production absolutely ballooned. I know it was heavily aided by a couple of big games there, but if you take his Dallas averages over the 9 games and extrapolate that over 16 weeks, that would have been good enough for wide receiver 10 in PPR in 2018. So, Steve, how did Coop fare last season from a consistency perspective? Because the perception out there is that he's really up and down. What did you find when you took a look at it from that angle?
Well, it's pretty much right in line with everyone's perception of Amari Cooper. When you look at it from the standpoint of you have him twice finishing in the top 6 in a given week for wide receivers, which it's pretty tough to do. And that ties him for WR11 11 in that metric. But then when you start looking at how many times he finishes as a top 12 and then a top 24, you see him drop to tied for WR21 for top 12 performances. You see him tied for WR19 for top 24 performances. And I do just want to point out really quick, his overall average weekly rank is WR32. And then a perfect example of that boom or bust kind of thing that we've seen from Amari Cooper throughout his entire NFL career so far is when you look at his fantasy playoff performance. He gives you a WR1 in week 1 of the fantasy playoffs. Phenomenal. He helps you win your first round of your fantasy football playoffs, but then he's a WR45 and a WR73 when it matters the most in the championship round. So when you look at the consistency numbers, when it comes to Amari Cooper, I mean, it's just the story of his career so far. Now with Amari, it's that WR12 price tag, the allure of that consistent Amari Cooper is built into that price tag. And God, it is tempting when you talk about the numbers you did, Ben. Imagine getting those numbers, maybe even pumped up a little bit because there's a little less bust and a little more boom. And it'll just be really interesting to see how things shake out in Dallas next year. It really will be, guys.
You're exactly right, Steve. Everybody is riding the wave that was the second half of last season on Amari Cooper, which is why you see his price as WR12 overall, giving him a WR1 value in drafts. We have him ranked as WR18, which I think is very reasonable for Coop, even though he's on a Dallas team that still has Zeke, still has an established, excellent running game, still has a great offensive line, still has limited weapons. You would think Michael Gallup would take a step in his second season, but really besides that, even though they brought in Randall Cobb, there isn't a lot of other passing options on that offense right now. And Jason Witten, while they brought him back as tight end, I don't know how much he's going to eat into the passing volume on that team. So he does present some value, but boy, WR12 is, you're really paying a premium. I don't know how much better you can do than that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely about his ceiling. I mean, he's got a lead upside,
right?
So you can't really limit his astronomical potential. However, within reason, I'm not going to pay the 12 price tag hoping that he's going to surpass that. I would much rather pay that 18 price tag and feel a lot better about him potentially surpassing that. But I will say all of his consistency studies and all my research, really nothing popped out at me with Coop except one thing. He still had 6 top 24 performances throughout the season last year, which was tied for wide receiver 19. So for me, even with his boom and bust, I think he still gives you a reasonable enough floor that if he's an upside guy that you want to roll the dice on with your wide receiver 2 equity with the hopes that he could be that elite guy, I can understand it. I just don't think I would go quite as high as that wide receiver 12.
And that WR19 ranking with 6 top 24 finishes is with switching teams mid-year.
And having an extra bye baked into that. He didn't miss a game due to injury. He only played 15 to 16 games last year because he had an extra bye due to the timing of his trade. Yeah. So all of his numbers are minus another game with the Cowboys. Right. So like Steve said, the Cowboys in general, as always, are interesting, but especially Amari Cooper, especially this year, they're going to be extremely interesting to watch. So moving on to one of their biggest rivals in the NFC East, the Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver Alshon Jeffrey is currently going as wide receiver 29 overall at the 609 spot. He's going behind the likes of Sammy Watkins and Tyler Boyd and in front of Dante Pettis and Robbie Anderson. Both the aggregate projections and Total Foresight like him as wide receiver 22. So already you can see a contrast, whereas we were just talking about Coop, who is Total Foresight's wide receiver 18 going as wide receiver 12. Now we've got a wide receiver 22 ranking from Total Foresight going as wide receiver 29. So that's your first, I won't call it a red flag, but that's your first clue to get your attention. Next clue to get your attention is that he's got one of the better strength of schedules at fantasypros.com this season, 3rd out of 32. We have him more as a middle of the road at Savage with 16th out of 32. Like Steve said, Maybe there's going to be a propensity to move back to a run like they did when they won their championship in 2017. But last year, they passed more than all but 6 other teams in the NFL. Alshon gutted out a painful shoulder injury, and talk out of minicamp so far is the chemistry that he and Wentz are getting the opportunity to develop. So again, when we talk about the price versus the potential production from Total Foresight, there's already some eye-opening value there. And then when you look at his career, wide receiver 81 his first year, then wide receiver 8. Wide receiver 10, couple of injury-riddled Jay Cutler seasons, wide receiver 42, wide receiver 55. Since joining the Eagles, he's been a pretty steady low-end wide receiver too. Wide receiver 22 years ago and wide receiver 26 last year in just 13 games. And like I said, that's gutting out a couple of big-time injuries. He seems to be fully healthy. And one thing I am watching very closely, if there is not one mention of one single injury, one single tweak, one single anything, Alshon is going to be high on my board. He finished as wide receiver 26 overall last year in just 13 games. His points per game was wide receiver 23. He was still wide receiver 25 in yards with 843 in 13 games while gutting out that injury. And minimum 50 receptions, he was wide receiver 20 with 13 yards per reception. And he added another 6 touchdowns on top of that. So, Jay, I know you love this guy. I know the next-gen stats don't pop with him, but I'm pretty sure you're as optimistic about Alshon as I am in 2019.
I am. And Steve, I cannot wait to hear how consistent he was. That's what I'm really intrigued to see. What was he like while he was battling through a nagging injury like he had?
He did a fairly decent job, guys. If you take a look, I mean, he tied as WR21 as far as top 6 performances, but he was WR13 overall when it came to finishing in the top 12. So a weekly WR1 finisher. WR13 in that metric is really nice on his behalf. I mean, you look at how many times he finishes as, WR2 in the top 24. He finished there 5 times, which is tied for WR23. So all around, pretty solid. And to kind of speak to what you guys had just mentioned as far as the potential value that you have there with Alshon, if you take his numbers from last year, his fantasy points per game, and you do extrapolate that out for a full season, that would have put him right at WR16 on the year. That's beautiful if you can get him where he's going in drafts right now. There's that upside. Sure, there's a little bit of that injury concern that you guys touched on, but like you said, Ben, if he is going into the season and he is healthy and things sound good and he actually got a chance to develop some more of a rapport with Carson Wentz, there's just a heck of a lot of upside there. And he's on my radar too, Ben.
Yeah, you know what? I think Alshon is very simple to summarize. He's being drafted WR29. Last season in 13 games battling through injury, he finished WR26. So going into a full slate, if he can be healthy, and he finished WR26 in 13 games unhealthy, then WR29 is very simple for him to beat, so his price point is fantastic.
Yes, it is.
All right, let's switch gears and dive into the New York Giants. A couple of interesting guys. Sterling Shepard actually going next in drafts as WR35 overall in the 8th round, 3rd selection, behind guys like Allen Robinson and Will Fuller, but in front of guys like Larry Fitzgerald and Geronimo Allison. In our Foresight projection, he is ranked as WR39, but in our total Foresight ranking, he is WR29, maybe a guy who can eat into some of those vacated targets. In his career, though, he has finished WR36, 42, and 30. So a nice, comfortable WR3 so far in Sterling Shepard's career. 16 games played last season he featured in. We love seeing that. And he finished WR23 in targets with 107 targets. You would think that number can climb this season. He finished WR26 in receptions with 66. The accuracy in the quarterback play is the issue, and we have discussed that. In receiving yards, he finished WR22 with 872. Guys, Shep could be in line for almost eclipsing 1,000 yards this season, potentially. In yards per reception, he was WR19 with a minimum of 50 catches with a 13.2 yards per reception average. Not bad.
Not at all. And then when you take a look at his next gen stats, he showed some explosiveness in the average separation metric. He was wide receiver, running back, tight end 42 overall. And then with his team's percentage of targeted air yards, he was wide receiver, running back, tight end 27 overall. And he was wide receiver, running back, tight end 45 in yak yards per reception. All of his numbers are not only sustainable, but in line to increase by like 20% as far as opportunity goes. And he's somebody that is lauded as a leader in that locker room. You know, the Giants aren't going to be good. There's going to be a lot of pass volume. He is a number one wide receiver in the NFL, going as wide receiver 35. And, you know, adding another 30 to 50 targets to his 107 last year makes for a potential significant role in 2019. Like, this guy could flirt with back end wide receiver 2 numbers and is being drafted like a flex play.
Okay, so I'm interested to hear a guy being taken in the 8th round who's been a career WR3 for 3 seasons, Steve. How consistent was he? Was he able to get in to the top 6, to the top 12, to the top 24 last season?
So Shep didn't have any elite fantasy finishes last year, so nothing in the top 6 to speak towards. And then when you look at him overall, I mean, really not a whole lot to speak to. Tied for WR26 as far as top 12 finishes. Tied for WR27 as far as top 24 finishes. And then overall, his overall weekly rank, WR28. So, I mean, overall, those are all putting him in that WR3, high-end WR3 conversation to speak towards, you know, the possible value that we could see with him next year. I think for me, overall, what I'm just interested to see is I've heard throughout the last couple of years of how much he struggles playing on the outside. And it'll just be interesting to see if he is put into that role in a majority of his snaps, you know, how he fares. Because I think all but one of his career touchdowns has come out of the slot.
No, that's a great point, Steve. And in my research about him and Golden Tate, it definitely is reading like Sterling is going to be penciled in as the outside guy, and Golden Tate is going to be the slot role in this offense primarily. And not to steal any thunder from the next one, but that might be the safer play and the better value this season.
It might be, but I have to say, going WR35 for a guy who's finished his career right around that spot, and we have him projected as WR29, then you're telling me he's WR26 in top 12 finishes, WR27 in top 24 finishes, and WR28 in average finish. I love our WR29 ranking in Total Foresight. I think that's fantastic and right on the money.
I think it's a great ranking, but as far as value goes, I will see your wide receiver 29 for a wide receiver 35 price tag, and I will raise you. Total Foresight likes Golden Tate as wide receiver 19, and his price tag is wide receiver 43, Jay.
That might be the steal of the draft right now.
Amen, brother. He's going in the back end of the 9th round behind DK Metcalf, D.D. Westbrook, in front of MVS and Cortland Sutton. So, I mean, his Foresight projection, the masses out there only like him to be wide receiver 33. Total Foresight likes him to be wide receiver 19, in part because of historical mass target share. But that price is insane, Jay. He was still wide receiver 18 last season, while he was switching teams with 113 targets. That speaks to wherever he goes, whether he's schemed or not, they want the man to have the football. He was tied for wide receiver 20 with 74 receptions. 16 games as arguably the highest targeted football player on an NFL team is going to do better than the wide receiver 43 price tag that you're currently having to pay for him. It is ridiculous. And like you said at the start, maybe the steal of the draft. And Steve, in a very tumultuous season where he was switching teams, how did he look from a consistency perspective?
You know, given everything that went against Golden Tate last year with both the teams he played on, he still finished tied for WR21 as far as top 6 finishes, tied as WR21 for top 12 finishes, tied for WR27 and top 24 finishes. But then even with all that, the tumultuous situation, he still finished as a respectable WR28 in his overall rank. And yeah, guys, WR43 it's just stupid. Ben, you talked about it a little bit when you touched on Saquon last episode. Like, Golden Tate's going to eat into those targets a little bit. And we all know how Eli Manning likes to throw the ball 6 yards downfield pretty much every time he drops back to pass. So, I mean, the targets are going to be there. And I think even if Daniel Jones gets thrust into action early, he's going to lean on Golden Tate there in the slot. So I absolutely love the value. I think Total Foresight nails it with a 19 overall ranking with him. And yeah, we're probably all going to be like fighting over him later on in our drafts here in our league of record.
And most importantly, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the ultimate newest iconic moment in Golden Tate's career this past 4th of July that you may have seen floating around on social media, where he catches a certain beverage out of midair while he's dressed like Uncle Sam, while he's on a parade float on the 4th of July, chugs it, tosses it like the champ that he is, and just kept on floating. So if you didn't have a good reason to draft Golden Tate before we gave you all the great information, you definitely do now. So moving on, I'll let you take this one, Jay. The first time we're going to let you cover a Philadelphia Eagles player on this episode tonight. We've got wide receiver Deshaun Jackson.
Deshaun Jackson coming back home to Philly. Now, a little bit later in his career, he is currently going as WR49 in drafts. This is in the 11th round now in drafts, behind rookie McCole Hardman, young player Curtis Samuel, but in front of guys like Dante Moncrief and James Washington. Now, Djax is the epitome of being a home run hitter, and he is your best ball dream scenario. Let me give you some stats. He was WR1 in yards per reception with a minimum of 40 catches with 18.9 yards per catch. He was WRT, wide receiver, running back, and tight end 2 overall in average targeted air yards. I mean, the guy is just a burner. He is a deep threat, but the issue is he only played 12 games last season. And Steve, I already know the answer, but I'm guessing he probably wasn't very consistent.
Yeah, we don't need to get into all the specifics, guys. But yeah, and you guys said it. What more can we say about Djax? He is the ultimate best ball kind of a guy. You get him on your best ball roster, and he's going to have those weeks where he pops off and helps you win the week. And in redraft, hey, he's a guy that you can pick up, stash on your bench, and if you need to flex somebody, he could hit a home run and win you your league out of the flex spot. No harm, no foul if he doesn't.
From a football perspective, he is a great threat to have on the outside. From a fantasy perspective, he's just not a consistent performer that you can trust anymore, unless you're playing best ball, in which case, when he hits that home run, you can cash in.
And he will help out that whole Philadelphia passing game, like he's helped every passing offense he's ever been on in his entire career.
Oh, did somebody just say Alshon Jeffrey again?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
All right, moving on. We've only got one wide receiver left to cover this episode. We are going to end it off on a strong note with Dallas Cowboys wide receiver Michael Gallup entering his second season as the wide receiver 64 currently, going in the mid to late 14th round behind Deebo Samuel, Marquise, we forgot you still played Goodwin, going in front of Andy Isabella and John Brown. The Foresight projection has him as wide receiver 56. His limited usage and limited sample size gives him a total Foresight ranking of wide receiver 77 entering the season. But please note, number one, he has a better than average Savage ranking, 13th out of 32 this season. And then Fantasy Pro strength of schedule has him as a top 5 wide receiver strength of schedule this year out of 32. We're going to say right here, right now on this podcast, sleeper alert. This guy is pretty much free and he has serious upside. He played all 16 games last year. As I'm going to talk about in a second, he's a yard per reception stud and his next gen stats are eye-opening. Not many wide receivers going that late in drafts offer the kind of upside that he does. He was wide receiver 11 last year, minimum 30 receptions with 15.4 yards per reception. And he clearly picked it up down the stretch once Coop came to town. And when you look at his next gen stats, Jay, it shows that he's a big play yak guy as well there too.
Yes. In next gen stats, his average targeted air yards, he was wide receiver, running back, and tight end 18. He's going as wide receiver 64 right now. As far as team percentage of targeted air yards, he was WRT 36. He's going as WR 64 right now. And again, in next gen stats, yards after completion per reception, He was WRT 37. Again, he's going as WR 64. The guy was asked to step in and be a number one receiver on an anemic passing offense that was out of sorts to start the season. When he finally got help and got some experience at the NFL level, you saw what he could start to become. So you would think a big step forward is coming in 2019.
I totally agree. I love the guy. I mean, he ends up on mocks in my team like 80% of the time. His price tag is just stupid to me. I don't know if he's one of those guys in 3 or 4 weeks we're all going to be crying because his ADP's climbed 4 rounds because we won't shut up about him. But right now, if his ADP doesn't change, man, again, Steve, he's another one that we're all going to be fighting over in our league of record, right?
Yeah, I think so, especially like you said, where he's going now in drafts, because you hit it on the head, Ben. Once Coop came to town, it kind of opened things up for him as far as targets were concerned. You saw him averaging a solid 5 targets a game there with Amari Cooper in the mix. And you have to think that next season he'll probably be around that 100, 110 range. And I can't see where that won't translate into being somebody you'd want to possibly start, as your WR3 each week.
Right. And again, it's all relative to the price. WR64, like the upside that he has is just insane. And, I don't know about you guys, but I'm really looking forward to watching the Cowboys team overall unfold and to see how Michael Gallup looks and all that.
I've got a list of since 2009 teams that lost over 100 targets per season, which the Dallas Cowboys aren't necessarily a part of that, but it lists all the players of when they were drafted and when their breakout season occurred. And only 5 out of 17 first-round players had a breakout season their first season. The closest comparable, the only third-rounder who had a monster season early in his career, T.Y. Hilton, and then you had John Brown, both with breakout seasons in their second season, not their first, after being taken in the third round. Just an interesting little nugget there.
I like it. We've talked about a few teams so far in this preview pod season so far that have had more than 100 vacated targets on their team, so that's definitely a relevant stat.
All right, great episode, guys. Let's wrap it up. We have a lot of great things coming this season. We have more preview podcasts heading your way. Don't forget, we have the Fantasy Foresight Challenge going on. All we ask for you to be considered to be a part of our fantasy league this year. Take on us, the Fantasy Foresight family, in a 12-team PPR contest. Go out to our link. It's on Twitter. Just make a simple $10 donation to the Special Olympics, and you will be in the running to take on the Foresight family, the winner of the Fantasy Foresight Challenge. The team that wins it all in 2019 in our league takes home $1,000 cash money. Boom.
Yes, sir. And one of the remaining 5 available spots for the Fantasy Foresight Challenge will be up for grabs on Sunday, August 18th in Canton, Ohio at the Midwest Fantasy Expo. Come check out Fantasy Foresight at booth 13. We'll be there all day Sunday. And Jay, you got any more to add to that?
I do. We always tell you we're always working on the next thing and to bring more to you and to give you more. And we've got something cooking even Ben and Steve don't know about. So just stay tuned.
Oh, man, I'm excited. In the meantime, we'll be back with you in just 2 days on Wednesday, July 10th to discuss the quarterbacks and running backs of the AFC West. It's going to be exciting. Can't wait.
And that wraps up this episode of Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We thank you for joining us. Be sure to visit us, as always, at fantasyforesight.com. Use the links at the bottom of the page to find us across social media, including Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and wherever you pod. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you next time.